All right, let's jump right in. We're going to explore a really fascinating paradox today: how two of the most foundational beliefs in Christianity, original sin and atonement, can sometimes, believe it or not, be the very things that create a huge hurdle for people who are exploring faith.
So picture this. You're someone looking for a sense of community, maybe a little more meaning in your life. You decide to walk into a pretty traditional church service for the very first time. You've got an open mind, you're curious. But as we're about to see, the experience can create some friction you probably weren't expecting.
And here's the thing. The source material we're looking at highlights how the very elements designed to forge a deep spiritual connection, the liturgy, the hymns, all those ancient rituals, can sometimes end up building a wall instead of a bridge for newcomers. Let's see how that happens.
Okay, let's get into it. Our newcomer has found a seat. The service starts, and often one of the very first things that happens is a group confession of sin.
Now, just imagine hearing this for the first time. For people who grew up in this tradition, this is the necessary first step before you get to the good stuff: grace and forgiveness. But if you're an outsider, being asked to identify yourself as inherently sinful and unclean right out of the gate can be a real shock to the system. And you can see how those same words can land so differently depending on who you are. For an adult who generally sees themselves as a good, ethical person, this whole concept might just feel, well, inauthentic. It doesn't match their lived experience. But for a young person who's already navigating all the challenges of building their identity, these words can hit much, much harder. They can clash with every message they hear about self-worth and can even trigger some pretty deep feelings of shame.
So, after the confession, the service usually moves toward its central moment: communion and the promise of forgiveness. And this is where that second core idea, atonement, becomes front and center, tying God's forgiveness directly to the violent death of Jesus.
These are incredibly powerful words in Christianity, spoken right at its most sacred ritual. They are the heart of the atonement story. But again, let's put on our newcomer's hat. Hearing that forgiveness is directly linked to a blood sacrifice, well, that can raise some pretty tough questions. And this is a huge hurdle for a lot of people, intellectually and morally. For a modern mindset that values things like restorative justice and nonviolence, the idea that a loving God would require a bloody, violent sacrifice can feel primitive or, frankly, even a bit unjust. And you can really see how this disconnect can spiral. For a newcomer, it might start with the symbolism of communion just feeling unsettling. That can then lead to deeper moral questions about the nature of God and justice. And ultimately, if you never bought into that initial idea of being an inherent sinner, the whole ritual can come across as morbid or just plain meaningless, leaving you feeling more on the outside than ever before. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the soundtrack of the service. Hymns are incredibly powerful. They aren't just songs, right? They're basically theology set to music, embedding these core beliefs into melodies that get stuck in your head long after you've left. I mean, this is probably one of the most famous hymns on the entire planet. But let's just stop and think about that one word, wretch. For a visitor, being asked to stand up and sing about yourself as a wretch, it can feel degrading. It clashes with pretty much every modern idea we have about self-respect and personal dignity. And some hymns get even more graphic. The source material points out that imagery like this, which is intended to convey the immense power of forgiveness, can actually cause revulsion instead of reverence. The idea of being plunged into a fountain filled with blood can be really disturbing if you're not used to that kind of symbolic language. And the crucial thing to understand is that this language has a real impact. For an adult, it might just feel degrading or overly focused on trauma. But for a young person, in an age where we're so much more aware of mental health, being asked to sing about being a wretch or being washed in blood can actually be damaging to their self-esteem. It can make church feel like a place that's focused on gore and death, not on life and hope. So let's pull all these threads together. What's the big picture here? Why do these ancient, profound traditions that are so meaningful to believers sometimes completely fail to connect with modern seekers? What is the fundamental gap? The disconnect really happens on multiple levels. It often starts with that feeling of inauthenticity, being asked to label yourself a sinner when it just doesn't resonate with how you see yourself. That can then spark these serious moral objections about a God who seems to require violence to forgive. It all adds up to this cultural and emotional barrier, where the language and the imagery feel not just old but alienating or, for some people, even genuinely triggering. So we're left with this massive question. What you should really take away from all this isn't a critique of anyone's faith, but an awareness of the challenge. It's the profound challenge of translating ancient, powerful truths across huge cultural and generational divides to make sure that a message of welcome is actually heard as one.